The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Adelaide Cottage as Catherine, Princess of Wales, sat quietly in her favorite armchair. The house felt unusually still, save for the distant sounds of her 3 children getting ready for school. Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis moved about their morning routines, unaware that their mother had spent most of the previous night staring at the ceiling, wrestling with words she never imagined she would have to speak. William had left early for an engagement, his jaw tight with the same tension that had gripped their household for weeks. The palace staff moved with careful efficiency, their usual cheerfulness replaced by a subdued professionalism that spoke volumes about the gravity of the situation. Everyone knew something was wrong, but few understood the full scope of what the royal family was facing. Catherine's phone buzzed softly on the side table. Another message from her private secretary, confirming the arrangements for later that day. The plans had been set in motion weeks ago, but now that the moment had arrived, the weight of reality felt almost unbearable. She picked up the device with trembling fingers, reading through the timeline that would change everything for her family. The children's voices grew louder as they gathered their school bags. Charlotte was looking for her favorite hair ribbon, the blue one that matched her school uniform. George was discussing football practice with Louis, who was still too young to fully understand the sport but listened with the devoted attention only a younger brother could provide. Their normalcy was both heartbreaking and precious to Catherine, who knew that after today, nothing would ever be quite the same. She had rehearsed the words countless times in her mind. Simple words, gentle words, but words that would shatter the innocence of childhood and thrust her family into a spotlight they had never wanted. The irony wasn't lost on her that as a member of the royal family, she had always lived under public scrutiny, but this was different. This was deeply personal, vulnerable in a way that made her feel exposed despite all the protection that surrounded her. The sound of footsteps on the stairs indicated that the children were coming down for breakfast. Catherine took a deep breath and smoothed her hands over her casual morning clothes. She had chosen comfortable clothing deliberately, wanting this conversation to feel as normal and safe as possible. The kitchen would be the right place, she had decided. Not the formal sitting room, not somewhere that felt official or frightening, but the heart of their home, where they shared meals and homework struggles and bedtime stories. William had wanted to be there for this conversation, but his schedule hadn't allowed it. They had discussed postponing, but Catherine felt strongly that the children needed to hear this from her first, in their own time and space, before the world began to speculate and comment. The decision had been agonizing, but she knew it was right. George entered the kitchen first, his school blazer slightly askew, and his hair still bearing the evidence of a restless night's sleep. At 10 years old, he carried himself with a seriousness that sometimes surprised Catherine, as if he understood instinctively that being the future king meant bearing responsibilities others his age couldn't imagine. Charlotte followed, chattering about a project she was working on for school, her enthusiasm infectious even in the midst of Catherine's anxiety. Louis bounded in last, his 6-year-old energy filling the room as he launched into a detailed account of a dream he'd had about dragons and castles. Catherine smiled despite herself, marveling at how children could find magic in the most ordinary moments. She would need to remember this feeling, she told herself, this pure joy in the everyday. It would be important in the days to come. The breakfast routine proceeded normally. Cereal and toast, orange juice, the gentle nagging about teeth brushing and backpack checking that formed the rhythm of their mornings. Catherine participated in it all, answering questions about homework and permission slips, but her mind was focused on the conversation that was coming. She had decided to wait until they were all settled, until the initial hunger was satisfied, and they had settled into the comfortable rhythm of family time. Finally, when the last piece of toast had been eaten, and Louis had finished his detailed explanation of why cornflakes were superior to all other breakfast foods, Catherine cleared her throat gently. The children looked up at her, and she was struck by how young they looked, how trusting. George's eyes held a flicker of awareness that something was different. His emotional intelligence already finely tuned to the moods of the adults around him. She reached across the table and took Charlotte's hand, then gestured for the boys to come closer. They gathered around her chair, sensing the shift in atmosphere but not yet alarmed. This was their mother. The person who kissed, scraped knees and read bedtime stories and made everything better. Whatever she had to tell them would be manageable because she would help them through it. Catherine looked into each of their faces, memorizing this moment before everything changed. George's serious brown eyes, Charlotte's bright curiosity, Louis's cheerful trust. These were the people who mattered most in the world, the reason she would find the strength to face whatever came next. The words came out quietly, simply, just as she had practiced. She told them that she had been sick, that the doctors had found something that needed very special treatment, and that she would need to spend time getting better. She used words they could understand without being frightening, explaining that she would still be their mother, still love them just as much, but that some things would be different for a while. George asked the first question, his voice small but steady. He wanted to know if she would be okay, if the treatment would work. Catherine answered, as honestly as she could, explaining that the doctors were very good at helping people with her kind of sickness, that she would do everything they told her to do to get better. Charlotte's response was typically direct. She wanted to know if this was why Mummy had been tired lately, why she had been spending so much time talking quietly with Daddy. Catherine nodded, touched by her daughter's perceptiveness. Yes, she said. This was why things had felt a little different recently. Louis, still young enough to see the world in simple terms, wanted to know if he could help make her feel better. Could he bring her tea like she did when he was sick? Could he draw her pictures? Catherine felt her throat tighten with emotion as she assured him that yes, those things would help very much indeed. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with questions and reassurances and gentle explanations. Catherine answered everything they asked with patience and honesty, calibrated to their ages and personalities. She explained that other people would find out about her illness, that there might be photographers and reporters interested in the story, but that the most important thing was that they were a family and they would face this together. When the children finally headed off to school, their goodbye hugs lasting a little longer than usual, Catherine remained at the kitchen table. The hardest part was over, she told herself. She had told her children, in her own words, in their own home, before anyone else could shape the narrative. Now came the next phase, informing the world. The palace communications team had been preparing for weeks. The statement had been written and rewritten, every word carefully considered for its impact on both the family's privacy and the public's right to information. The timing had been coordinated with William's schedule, with the children's school commitments, with a dozen other factors that needed to align for the announcement to proceed as smoothly as possible. Catherine's phone rang as she sat in the quiet kitchen. Her private secretary's voice was gentle but efficient, confirming that everything was ready for the afternoon's announcement. The statement would be released at precisely the time they had agreed upon, followed by a brief video message that Catherine had recorded days earlier. The video had been the hardest part, she reflected. Looking into the camera and speaking to millions of people about something so personal had required every ounce of strength she possessed. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of final preparations. William returned from his engagement, and they spent time together reviewing the plans one final time. There would be no interviews, no additional statements, just the carefully crafted announcement that would tell their story in their own words. After that, they would retreat into privacy while Catherine began her treatment. The irony of needing to make such a private struggle public wasn't lost on either of them. As members of the royal family, their lives belonged partly to the public, but this felt different. This was about survival, about fighting for the future of their family, about facing down fear with courage and dignity. As the afternoon approached, Catherine found herself thinking about all the other families facing similar battles. The ordinary families who could fight their battles away from cameras and headlines, but also the families who didn't have access to the best medical care, the best support systems. Her situation was unique in its public nature, but the fundamental experience of facing a serious illness was heartbreakingly common. The statement would go out in less than 2 hours. After that, there would be no going back to the quiet struggle they had been managing privately. The world would know, would have opinions, would offer support and criticism in equal measure. But the children knew first, from her own lips, in their own kitchen. That was what mattered most. Catherine stood up from the kitchen table and walked to the window, looking out at the garden where her children played. where they had picnics and birthday parties and all the ordinary magical moments that made up a family's life. Tomorrow this view would be the same, but everything else would be different. She was ready for that change, as ready as anyone could be for such a moment. The palace confirmation was still hours away, but in her heart, Catherine had already spoken the words that mattered most. She had whispered them to her children, and now the rest of the world would hear them too. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of the palace courtyard as the communications team made their final preparations. Inside the ornate offices that had witnessed decades of royal announcements, both triumphant and tragic, a different kind of history was about to be made. This was not the announcement of a birth or an engagement, not the news of a state visit or a charitable patronage. This was raw, human vulnerability being shared with a world that was accustomed to viewing royalty as somehow above the ordinary struggles of life. Sir Clive Alderton, the private secretary to the king, reviewed the statement one final time. Every word had been scrutinized by lawyers, doctors, communications experts, and most importantly, by William and Catherine themselves. The language needed to be clear enough to prevent speculation while remaining private enough to protect the family's dignity. It was a delicate balance that required diplomatic skill honed over decades of royal service. The media had been restless for weeks. Speculation about Catherine's absence from public engagements had been growing steadily, with theories ranging from the mundane to the wildly imaginative. Royal correspondents who had covered the family for years knew that something significant was happening, but the palace's silence had been complete until now. That silence was about to be broken in a way that would reshape how the public viewed the Princess of Wales. At exactly 2:30 p.m., the statement was released simultaneously to every major news outlet in the country. The words appeared on screens and phones across the nation within minutes, spreading through social media with the speed that characterized modern communication. The Princess of Wales has been diagnosed with cancer and is undergoing preventative chemotherapy treatment, the statement read, its simple directness cutting through months of speculation with devastating clarity. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. News anchors interrupted regular programming to share the announcement, their usual professional composure cracking slightly as they processed the personal nature of the story. Social media platforms erupted with messages of support, shock, and in some cases, skepticism from those who had grown cynical about royal communications. The number Pray for Catherine hashtag began trending within an hour, accompanied by thousands of messages from ordinary people sharing their own experiences with cancer and offering encouragement. In newsrooms across London, editors scrambled to adjust their front pages and lead stories. This was not just royal news. It was human interest on the most fundamental level. The Princess of Wales, known for her grace under pressure and her dedication to public service, was facing the same terrifying diagnosis that affected hundreds of thousands of people each year. The story transcended royal watching and became something much more universal. The video message that accompanied the written statement was perhaps even more powerful than the words themselves. Catherine had recorded it days earlier, sitting on a bench in the Windsor Gardens where she and William had walked during their courtship. Her voice was steady but carried the weight of emotion that no amount of media training could completely conceal. She spoke directly to the camera, to the millions of people who would watch, explaining her situation with the same care and consideration she had shown her children. The choice of location for the video was deliberate. Not a formal palace setting, not surrounded by the trappings of royalty, but in a natural setting that emphasized her humanity. She wore a simple striped sweater and spoke in the tone of a mother talking to extended family, because that was how she had come to view the British public after more than a decade of royal duty. This, of course, came as a huge shock, she said in the video, her hands clasped in her lap to keep them steady. William and I have been doing everything we can to process and manage this privately, for the sake of our young family. As you can imagine, this has taken time. It has taken me time to recover from major surgery in order to start my treatment. The honesty of her words struck viewers immediately. There was no attempt to minimize the seriousness of the situation, no false cheerfulness or royal stoicism. This was a woman acknowledging that she was scared, that she was fighting, and that she needed time and space to heal. The vulnerability was unprecedented in modern royal communication. Medical experts across the country found themselves fielding calls from news programs, explaining cancer treatment protocols, and offering context for the public's understanding. The fact that Catherine was undergoing preventative chemotherapy suggested that the cancer had been caught relatively early, which was encouraging, but the treatment itself would be grueling regardless of the stage of the disease. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a leading oncologist at London's Royal Marsden Hospital, explained to reporters that modern cancer treatment had advanced significantly in recent years, but that the emotional and physical toll remained substantial. "What the princess is facing is something that thousands of people deal with every day," she said. "The treatment can be exhausting, the uncertainty is frightening, and the impact on family life is profound. The fact that she's choosing to share this publicly may help reduce the stigma that still surrounds cancer diagnosis." The response from other members of the royal family was swift and supportive. King Charles, who had recently undergone his own cancer treatment, released a statement expressing his pride in Catherine's courage and requesting privacy for the family during this difficult time. Prince Harry and Meghan, despite their strained relationship with the rest of the royal family, issued their own message of support, temporarily setting aside personal differences in the face of a health crisis. International leaders joined the chorus of support. President Biden and First Lady Jill Biden, who had their own experience with cancer in their family, sent personal messages. The Prime Minister canceled a planned parliamentary appearance to record a video message expressing the nation's support for the princess and her family. It became clear that this announcement had touched something deeper than royal protocol or political positioning. In the hours following the announcement, cancer charities reported a surge in calls to their helplines. People who had been putting off medical checkups suddenly made appointments. The Catherine effect, which had previously been applied to fashion trends and charitable giving, was now extending to health awareness. Her openness about her diagnosis was encouraging others to take their own health concerns seriously. The media coverage, while extensive, was notably respectful in tone. Even publications that had been critical of the royal family in recent years approached the story with sensitivity. There was an understanding that this crossed a line from public interest into private struggle, and that the princess's willingness to share her situation publicly should be met with dignity rather than sensationalism. Royal correspondent Victoria Murphy, writing for a major newspaper, captured the mood perfectly. "This is not a story about royal privilege or institutional protocol. This is about a mother of 3 young children, facing every parent's worst nightmare while trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy for her family. The fact that she happens to be the Princess of Wales makes the situation more public, but not less human." As evening approached, vigils began appearing outside royal residences across the country. Not organized demonstrations, but spontaneous gatherings of people who felt moved to show their support in a tangible way. Flowers, cards, and small gifts accumulated at the gates of Buckingham Palace, Kensington Palace, and Windsor Castle. Many of the messages came from cancer survivors and their families, sharing their own stories and offering encouragement. The economic impact was also immediate and significant. Shares in cancer research companies rose, as investors anticipated increased funding and attention for the field. Charitable donations to cancer research organizations spiked dramatically, with many donors specifically citing Catherine's announcement as their motivation for giving. In the quiet of Adelaide Cottage, far from the media circus that had erupted around their family, William and Catherine sat together as the children did their homework in the next room. The relief of having the secret finally public was palpable, but so was the anxiety about what would come next. They had prepared for this moment for weeks, but the reality of global attention focused on such a personal struggle was still overwhelming. Catherine's phone had been switched off hours earlier, but William's continued to buzz with messages from friends, family members, and official contacts. The support was touching, but the sheer volume was exhausting. They had made a decision to limit their communication to essential contacts only while Catherine focused on her treatment and recovery. The children had returned from school to find their home surrounded by additional security personnel and photographers camped outside the gates. George, old enough to understand the significance of the media presence, asked if this was what it would be like from now on. William assured him that the intensity would fade, but that there would likely be continued interest for some time. Charlotte had come home with a card made by her classmates, expressing their hope that her mother would feel better soon. The gesture from 7 and 8-year-olds who barely understood what cancer meant was particularly moving to Catherine. It reminded her that while the world's attention felt overwhelming, much of it came from genuine care and concern. The palace communications team worked late into the night, monitoring global coverage and responding to media requests. The decision had been made to limit additional statements or interviews, allowing the initial announcement to speak for itself. Any updates about Catherine's condition would be shared only when there was meaningful news to report, not to satisfy media demand for content. As the first day of public knowledge drew to a close, the full magnitude of the situation was becoming clear. This was not just a royal health crisis. It was a moment that had touched millions of people who saw their own fears and hopes reflected in Catherine's experience. The princess, who had always carried herself with grace and dignity, was now facing the most challenging battle of her life. And she was doing so with the eyes of the world watching. The devastating truth that Catherine had whispered to her children that morning was now shared with the entire world. The palace had confirmed what she had told them in the safety of their kitchen, and there was no going back. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new treatments, and new uncertainties, but it would also bring the support of millions of people who had been touched by her courage in sharing something so deeply personal. 3 months after the announcement that shook the nation, Catherine sat in the private garden behind Adelaide Cottage, a light blanket across her lap despite the warm June sunshine. The treatment had been everything the doctors had warned her it would be and more. The fatigue that seemed to seep into her very bones, the nausea that came in waves, the strange disconnection from her own body, as powerful medicines fought an invisible enemy. But she was fighting, and more importantly, she was winning. The scarves and headscarves that had become part of her daily wardrobe were carefully chosen each morning, not for fashion but for comfort and confidence. Hair loss had been one of the side effects she had dreaded most. Not from vanity, but because it made the illness visible in a way that felt vulnerable beyond anything she had experienced. Yet even this challenge had brought unexpected gifts. Louis had declared that her headscarves made her look like a pirate queen, and Charlotte had started a collection of colorful scarves to match her mother's, turning solidarity into a game. William had become her anchor in ways she hadn't anticipated. The man who had always been supportive became fiercely protective, rearranging his entire schedule around her treatment appointments and bad days. He had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated how she was feeling, bringing tea without being asked, and taking over bedtime stories when her voice was too tired for reading aloud. The children had adapted with the remarkable resilience of childhood, though each in their own way. George had become more serious, more protective of both his mother and his younger siblings. He had asked careful questions about the treatment, wanting to understand the science behind what was happening. Catherine had been touched by his maturity, while also worrying about the weight he was carrying at such a young age. Charlotte had channeled her energy into caring activities, making cards and pictures that covered Catherine's bedside table and the refrigerator. She had also become fiercely defensive of her mother's privacy, reportedly telling a photographer who had gotten too close to the school gates that her mother needed to rest and they should go away. The story had made William both proud and sad, recognizing that his 8-year-old daughter was already learning to navigate the complex relationship between royal duty and personal boundaries. Louis, still young enough to live largely in the present moment, had been the source of countless moments of joy during the darkest days. His innocent questions and unstudied affection had often been exactly what Catherine needed when the weight of everything felt overwhelming. He had developed a ritual of bringing her his favorite stuffed animal when she wasn't feeling well, solemnly explaining that it would help her feel better just like it helped him. The medical team at the private clinic had become like extended family over the months of treatment. Dr. Amanda Thornton, Catherine's oncologist, had become someone she trusted completely, not just for her medical expertise but for her ability to explain complex treatments in ways that felt manageable. The nursing staff had learned Catherine's preferences, knew when she needed quiet and when she welcomed conversation, and had shown the kind of professional compassion that made difficult days bearable. The treatment protocol had been aggressive but successful. The chemotherapy regimen, tailored specifically to Catherine's type of cancer, had targeted the disease with precision while minimizing damage to healthy cells. Regular scans had shown steady progress, with tumor markers decreasing and no evidence of spread to other areas. Each positive result had felt like a small victory, building toward what everyone hoped would be complete remission. Public support had remained remarkably consistent throughout the months of treatment. The initial wave of sympathy had settled into something deeper and more sustained. Cancer survivors from across the Commonwealth had written letters, sharing their own experiences and offering encouragement. Children had sent drawings, elderly people had shared stories of their own battles, and medical professionals had offered their expertise and support. The palace had issued periodic updates about Catherine's progress, carefully balancing the public's legitimate interest with the family's need for privacy. The statements had been brief and factual, confirming that treatment was proceeding as planned and expressing gratitude for the continued support. Catherine had specifically requested that any updates emphasize the normalcy of her experience, hoping to reduce the fear and stigma that still surrounded cancer diagnosis. One particularly moving moment had come when a group of children from a London cancer ward had sent a video message to Catherine. They had recorded themselves singing a song about being brave, with each child sharing one thing that helped them feel strong during treatment. The video had arrived during a particularly difficult week of chemotherapy, and Catherine had watched it repeatedly, drawing strength from their courage. The impact of Catherine's openness about her diagnosis had extended far beyond expressions of personal support. Cancer research funding had increased dramatically, with several major pharmaceutical companies announcing new initiatives specifically inspired by the public attention her case had brought to the field. Early detection programs had seen significant increases in participation. As people became more aware of the importance of regular screening, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, Director of Cancer Research UK, had spoken publicly about what she called the Catherine effect on cancer awareness. The princess's willingness to share her experience has saved lives, she said during a medical conference. We've seen a measurable increase in people seeking early screening, particularly among young women who might have previously ignored symptoms or postponed checkups. Her courage in speaking about this publicly has created a ripple effect that will benefit countless families. The international medical community had also taken notice. Catherine had agreed to participate in a research study tracking the psychological impact of cancer treatment on working mothers, contributing data that would help develop better support systems for other women facing similar challenges. The decision to participate in research, even while dealing with her own treatment, was typical of her commitment to using her platform for broader benefit. As summer progressed and Catherine's strength gradually returned, discussions began about her eventual return to public duties. The decision would be made carefully, based entirely on her health and energy levels. But the prospect of resuming royal engagements represented hope for complete recovery. The charities she patronized had been wonderfully supportive during her absence, understanding that her health took priority over all other commitments. The first public appearance would be significant, both symbolically and practically. The palace communications team had been planning carefully, considering venues and activities that would feel appropriate for someone returning to public life after serious illness. Catherine had expressed interest in visiting the cancer ward at Great Ormond Street Hospital, wanting her first engagement to honor the medical professionals and families who had supported her through treatment. Throughout the long months of treatment, William had kept a private journal, documenting not just the medical milestones, but the small moments that had sustained them as a family. Charlotte's first successful attempt at making tea for her mother, George's proud presentation of a school project about cancer research, Louis's elaborate plans for a welcome home party when Mummy felt completely better. These moments, he wrote, were what real strength looked like. The extended royal family had rallied around them in ways that sometimes surprised the public, who were more familiar with stories of royal disagreements and protocol disputes. King Charles had visited regularly, often bringing books and puzzles that he thought might help during the long days of recovery. Queen Camilla had quietly coordinated practical support, ensuring that household needs were managed without Catherine having to think about logistics. Even Harry had maintained regular contact, despite the geographical distance and family tensions that had dominated headlines in recent years. The shared experience of watching a loved one face serious illness had put other disagreements into perspective, reminding everyone involved of what truly mattered. Meghan had sent care packages filled with thoughtful items chosen specifically for someone undergoing cancer treatment, drawing on her own network of friends who had faced similar challenges. As Catherine reflected on the journey from that morning in the kitchen when she had whispered the devastating news to her children, to this afternoon when she felt strong enough to walk in her garden, The transformation felt miraculous. Not just the physical recovery, though that was profound, but the emotional growth that had accompanied the medical treatment. She had learned things about herself that she might never have discovered otherwise. The depth of her own strength, the power of vulnerability, honestly shared, the way that facing mortality could actually enhance appreciation for life. The experience had been terrible and transformative in equal measure, stripping away everything non-essential and revealing what truly mattered. The letters and messages that continued to arrive daily had shown her something beautiful about human nature. People who had never met her, who knew her only as a public figure, had opened their hearts and shared their own stories of struggle and survival. Cancer patients undergoing treatment had written to encourage her. Survivors had shared their hope. Family members had offered practical advice based on their own experiences supporting loved ones through similar journeys. One letter that particularly moved her had come from a young mother in Scotland who had been diagnosed with the same type of cancer just weeks after Catherine's announcement. "Seeing someone like you go through this made me feel less alone," the woman had written. "If the Princess of Wales can be scared and brave at the same time, then maybe I can be too." The letter captured something essential about the unexpected gift of shared vulnerability. The final scan results had been unequivocally positive. No evidence of disease, clear margins, excellent response to treatment. The words that every cancer patient hoped to hear, delivered by Dr. Thornton with the kind of professional joy that never got old, even after years of delivering similar news to grateful families. William had cried openly in the consultation room. Months of carefully controlled anxiety finally released in tears of relief and gratitude. The children had celebrated the news with characteristic enthusiasm. George had immediately begun planning a family holiday, somewhere they could be completely private and together. Charlotte had announced that they should have a party with a cake that said, "Mummy won," in bright pink icing. Louis had simply climbed into Catherine's lap and announced that he had known all along that she would feel better because she was the strongest person in the world. As the sun began to set over the garden where Catherine sat, reflecting on this extraordinary year, she felt a profound sense of gratitude, not just for the medical skill that had saved her life, or the family love that had sustained her, but for the unexpected gift of perspective that serious illness had brought. She had learned to distinguish between what was urgent and what was important, between what required her attention and what simply demanded it. The experience had also deepened her understanding of her role as a public figure. The response to her illness had shown her the power of authentic communication, the way that sharing genuine human experience could create connection across all the usual barriers of class, nationality, and circumstance. It was a lesson that would influence how she approached royal duties for the rest of her life. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities. But tonight Catherine was content to sit in her garden, surrounded by the simple beauty of flowers and evening light, alive and grateful, and ready for whatever came next. The devastating truth she had whispered to her children 9 months earlier had become a story of survival, strength, and the unexpected gifts that could emerge from life's most difficult chapters.